The rain hammered against the windows of the downtown apartment building as Sarah Chen made her way up the narrow staircase. Her worn sneakers barely made a sound against the concrete steps, a habit ingrained from years of training that most people in this neighborhood would never understand. To them, she was just another quiet tenant in apartment 4B who worked odd hours and kept to herself. Sarah had moved to this rundown building 6 months ago, seeking anonymity after her discharge from the military. The official records listed her as a communications specialist, but the truth was buried so deep in classified files that even she sometimes wondered if it had all been a dream. 12 years of her life spent in the shadows, operating in places that didn't exist on any map, completing missions that would never make it into history books. Now, at 34, she was trying to build something resembling a normal life. The small apartment was nothing like the sparse military quarters she'd grown accustomed to, but it was hers. She'd even bought a small, succulent plant that somehow managed to survive despite her frequent absences for her new job at a local security firm. Tonight had been particularly long. Her shift at the warehouse had run late due to a delivery mix-up, and all she wanted was to heat up some leftover Chinese takeout and catch up on the news. She'd been working civilian jobs for 8 months now, and the adjustment was harder than any mission she'd ever completed. The constant noise of city life, the unpredictable schedules of normal people, the luxury of complaining about minor inconveniences, it all felt surreal. As she reached the 4th floor, Sarah noticed the hallway light flickering again. She made a mental note to mention it to Mrs. Patterson, the elderly building manager who seemed to genuinely care about the tenants despite the building's obvious limitations. The woman reminded Sarah of her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. Sarah fumbled with her keys, muscle memory guiding her hands while her mind wandered to the phone call she'd received that morning. Her former commanding officer had reached out through encrypted channels, asking if she was interested in consulting work. The money would be good, and it would utilize skills that were growing rusty in civilian life. But it would also mean stepping back into a world she'd worked hard to leave behind. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs above caught her attention. It wasn't unusual. The 5th floor housed several young men who worked construction and often came home late. But something about the rhythm felt different tonight. More deliberate, more coordinated. Sarah had learned long ago to trust her instincts. In her previous life, that trust had been the difference between completing a mission and never coming home. Her hand instinctively moved to her hip, reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. Old habits died hard. 3 men emerged from the stairwell leading to the roof access. Sarah recognized them immediately. Marcus Webb, Tony Castellano, and Jake Morrison. They were part of a group that hung around the building's entrance most evenings, dealing drugs and intimidating anyone who might cause problems for their business. Sarah had observed their operation from her window, but had deliberately avoided any interaction. Marcus was the leader, a tall man with tattooed arms and a reputation for violence that extended well beyond this neighborhood. Tony was the muscle, built like a boxer and known for his quick temper. Jake was young, maybe 22, and always seemed nervous, like he was trying to prove himself worthy of running with the older men. "Well, look what we have here," Marcus said. His voice carrying that particular tone Sarah had heard countless times before, the sound of a predator who believed he'd found easy prey. "Little Miss Quiet from 4B. Sarah's mind automatically shifted into assessment mode. 3 men blocking the stairway above. The stairway below led down to more of their associates, who were probably positioned at various points throughout the building. No easy escape route. Her apartment was 20 feet away, but she'd have to turn her back to them to reach it. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, continuing to sort through her keys. "Excuse me, I just need to get to my apartment." Tony stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. We need to have a little conversation first. You see, we've been watching you, coming and going at weird hours, keeping to yourself, never socializing with the neighbors. Some people might think you're up to something, Jake added, his voice higher than the others, betraying his nervousness despite his attempt to sound threatening. Sarah had encountered similar situations in Baghdad, Kandahar, and a dozen other places where local power structures had to be navigated carefully. The key was to appear non-threatening while maintaining situational awareness and keeping options open. "I work security," she said simply. "Odd hours come with the territory. I'm not causing any trouble for anyone." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "See, that's where you're wrong. Your presence here is trouble. People in this building know to mind their own business, pay their little fee for protection, and keep their mouths shut. But you're different." The truth was that Sarah had been different her entire life. Growing up in foster care after her grandmother's death had taught her to be self-reliant and observant. Military service had honed those traits into something much more dangerous. She'd spent years learning to read people, to anticipate threats, to neutralize problems before they could escalate. "I pay my rent to Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said. "I don't know anything about fees." That was technically true. She'd noticed the pattern. Small amounts of money changing hands, conversations that stopped when she appeared, the way certain tenants seemed nervous around these men. But she'd made a deliberate choice to avoid getting involved. Her old life had been about protecting people and serving something larger than herself. Her new life was supposed to be about finding peace. "See, that's gonna change," Tony said, taking another step closer. "Everyone pays. It's for protection. You understand? Bad things happen to people who don't have protection." Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Tony's stance indicated he was right-handed. Probably favored hooks over straight punches based on his body type. Marcus stayed back, suggesting he was more strategic, letting others do the physical work. Jake kept shifting his weight, nervous energy that would make him unpredictable, but also unfocused. "How much?" she asked, playing for time while calculating angles and distances. "For you, special rate," Marcus grinned. "500 a month. Plus a little something extra for being so antisocial." It was extortion, plain and simple. Sarah had seen it countless times in conflict zones where local strongmen preyed on civilians. The difference was that in those places, she'd had the authority and resources to do something about it. Here, she was just another civilian, and getting involved would mean exposure she couldn't afford. "That seems excessive," she said carefully. "Life's expensive," Tony shrugged. "But we're reasonable people. We understand cash flow problems. Maybe we work out a different arrangement." The way he looked at her made his meaning clear. Sarah felt a familiar cold anger building in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced when encountering human traffickers and war criminals. But she forced herself to remain calm. These men had no idea who they were dealing with, and that was both an advantage and a problem. "I need to think about it," she said. "Thinking time's over," Marcus said. "You can pay us, or we can discuss other options, but this conversation doesn't end until we have an understanding." Jake moved to block the stairway while Tony stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. It was a classic intimidation tactic, and in her former life, Sarah would have ended this conversation within 30 seconds. But her former life was supposed to be over. "I don't have that kind of money," she said. "Then we have a problem," Marcus said. "See, we can't let people think they can just ignore us. Bad for business, you understand? So we need to send a message." The logical part of Sarah's mind knew she should just pay them. $500 was manageable, and avoiding confrontation would allow her to maintain her cover and continue building her civilian life. But another part of her, the part that had spent years fighting bullies on a global scale, rebelled against the idea of giving in to extortion. "What kind of message?" she asked. "The kind that makes sure everyone in this building understands how things work around here," Tony said, reaching out to grab her arm. Sarah's reflexes took over before her conscious mind could stop them. Tony's hand never reached her arm. Instead, he found himself stumbling backward, his wrist bent at an uncomfortable angle, wondering how he'd ended up in that position. The movement had been so quick and subtle that Jake and Marcus barely registered what had happened. "Careful," Sarah said quietly. "I startled easily." Tony rubbed his wrist, confusion and anger warring on his face. "What the hell was that?" "Self-defense classes," Sarah said. "You moved too fast. Made me nervous." Marcus studied her more carefully now. Something in her posture, her calm demeanor in the face of three men who had a reputation for violence, didn't fit his understanding of how this conversation should be going. "You know what? I think you need some time to consider your options," he said. "Jake, Tony, why don't we show our new friend upstairs? Give her a chance to see the building from a different perspective." Sarah knew where this was heading. The roof access was 20 feet above, and men like these had thrown people off buildings before. It was a classic intimidation tactic that sometimes went too far. In her old life, she would have neutralized all three of them before they could reach the stairway. But her old life was supposed to be over. "That's not necessary," she said. "Oh, but it is," Marcus replied. "See, respect is earned around here, and right now, you haven't earned any." They moved to surround her, and Sarah found herself being herded toward the stairs leading to the roof access. Each step took her further from her apartment, from the quiet life she'd been trying to build. With each step, the civilian persona she'd been carefully constructing began to feel more and more like a costume she was wearing. The roof access door was old and heavy, the kind that slammed shut and locked automatically. Sarah knew that once they got her up there, her options would become very limited. The building was 5 stories tall, surrounded by shorter structures that would make jumping impossible. The roof access was the only way down. "Beautiful night," Marcus commented as they climbed. "Clear sky, nice view of the city, perfect for having important conversations." Tony was breathing heavily by the time they reached the roof, his earlier encounter with Sarah having left him more unsettled than he wanted to admit. Jake kept looking back at her, as if expecting her to try something, but Sarah moved calmly, appearing resigned to whatever was about to happen. The door opened with a loud creak, revealing the building's flat roof. Air conditioning units hummed in the corners, and the city sprawled out before them, lights twinkling in the distance. It would have been peaceful under different circumstances. "Now then," Marcus said, positioning himself between Sarah and the door. "Let's have that conversation about respect." The roof was maybe 40 feet square, surrounded by a low wall that came up to about waist height. Sarah automatically cataloged potential weapons, loose pieces of metal from the air conditioning units, a maintenance toolbox near the door, various pipes and fixtures that could be used defensively. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said. "No misunderstanding," Tony said, still rubbing his wrist. "You disrespected me downstairs. Now you need to learn about consequences." Jake moved to her left while Marcus stayed near the door. They were spreading out, eliminating her escape routes. In her former life, Sarah had been in similar situations countless times, usually while trying to extract intelligence from hostile territory. The difference was that then, she'd been armed, equipped, and supported by a team. "Last chance," Marcus said. "You can apologize, pay what you owe, and we all go downstairs as friends. Or this gets unpleasant." Sarah looked out over the city, considering her options. Below, people were living normal lives, watching television, having dinner, putting children to bed. Simple, peaceful lives that she'd once protected from a distance. The life she'd been trying to join. "I don't think I owe you anything," she said quietly. Marcus nodded to Tony, who stepped forward with considerably more caution than he'd shown downstairs. But caution wasn't enough. Not against someone who'd spent 12 years learning to survive in places where hesitation meant death. Tony reached for her again, and this time Sarah didn't hold back. Her response was swift, precise, and devastating. Tony found himself on the ground, gasping for air, unable to understand how he'd gotten there. Jake started forward, then stopped when Sarah's gaze fixed on him. "I really don't want any trouble," she said, her voice still calm, but carrying an edge that made Jake take a step backward. Marcus was reassessing the situation now. The woman standing before him wasn't the quiet tenant he'd expected to intimidate. Her posture had changed subtly, becoming more balanced, more ready. Her eyes were scanning the rooftop in a way that suggested tactical thinking rather than panic. "Who are you?" he asked. "Someone who just wants to go home and eat leftover Chinese food," Sarah replied. But it was too late for simple answers. Tony was getting back to his feet, rage overriding caution. Jake was looking to Marcus for guidance, and Marcus was realizing that this situation had moved beyond simple extortion into something more dangerous. "You made a mistake coming up here," Marcus said, pulling a knife from his pocket. "Should have just paid what you owed." Sarah sighed. She'd hoped to avoid this, but some situations only had one resolution. "You're right," she said. "Someone did make a mistake." What happened next would be talked about in the neighborhood for years, though the details would vary depending on who was telling the story. What remained consistent was that 3 men had taken a quiet woman up to the roof to teach her a lesson about respect, and only 2 of them had come down. The 3rd man, Marcus Webb, was found the next morning on the roof, tied up with strips torn from his own shirt, babbling about a woman who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. By the time police arrived, Sarah Chen had already disappeared, leaving behind only a forwarded address and a note to Mrs. Patterson apologizing for the sudden departure. The official report listed it as a case of criminals turning on each other, which was easier to believe than Marcus's story about a woman who fought like a professional soldier. Tony and Jake corroborated the official version, both having decided that some secrets were worth keeping. But in certain circles, among people who specialized in violence and understood what it looked like when someone with real training decided to stop holding back, word began to spread about a woman who'd taken on 3 armed men on a rooftop and walked away without a scratch. By morning, Sarah Chen was already 3 states away, driving toward a new life and hoping this time she could find a place where the past wouldn't follow her. But deep down, she knew that some things could never be left behind completely. The phone in her car rang as she drove through the dawn, the encrypted number telling her everything she needed to know about who was calling. "I hear you had some excitement last night," her former commanding officer said without preamble. "News travels fast," Sarah replied. "It does when it involves people with your particular skill set. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" Sarah looked out at the highway stretching ahead, leading to another anonymous town where she could try to build another quiet life. But she also thought about Mrs. Patterson and the other tenants who would still be dealing with men like Marcus and Tony. "I'll call you back," she said, ending the connection. The woman in apartment 4B was gone, but Sarah Chen was beginning to realize that some responsibilities could never be abandoned completely. 3 weeks after the rooftop incident, Sarah Chen sat in a small diner outside Bakersfield, California, stirring sugar into coffee she didn't really want to drink. The morning news played on a television mounted in the corner, the volume low enough that she had to strain to hear the reporter discussing a drug bust in her former neighborhood. The building where she'd lived was shown briefly, yellow police tape across the entrance, and Sarah felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. The news report mentioned that an investigation into local drug operations had uncovered evidence of extortion, witness intimidation, and several unsolved assaults. 3 men were in custody, including Marcus Webb and Tony Castellano. Jake Morrison had apparently decided to cooperate with authorities in exchange for reduced charges. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an encrypted number. "Clean sweep. Your friends won't be bothering anyone for a long time. Coffee tomorrow? Same place as always. Jay." She deleted the message immediately, but couldn't delete the relief that came with knowing Mrs. Patterson and the other tenants were finally safe. Still, she wondered what other consequences her moment of action on that rooftop might have set in motion. The diner was the kind of place that existed in small towns across America. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, and coffee that had been brewing since dawn. Sarah had chosen it specifically because it was unremarkable, the sort of place where a woman traveling alone could sit for hours without drawing attention. She'd been doing this dance for 12 years, learning to blend into civilian environments while maintaining the heightened awareness that had kept her alive in hostile territories. Her real training had begun long before the military, though. Growing up in the foster care system had taught her to read rooms quickly, to understand power dynamics, and to make herself useful enough to avoid trouble but not so visible as to become a target. When she'd aged out at 18 with no family and no support system, the military recruiter had seemed like salvation. Basic training had been easier for her than for most recruits because she was already accustomed to instability, to sleeping in unfamiliar places, to following orders from authority figures who might or might not have her best interests at heart. What she hadn't expected was discovering that she had a natural talent for the kind of work that happened in the shadows. Her first deployment had been to Afghanistan, officially as a communications specialist, but actually as part of a joint task force that didn't appear on any organizational chart. Her commanding officer, Colonel James Morrison, no relation to Jake despite the name, had recognized something in her that reminded him of his best operators. By her second deployment, she was running solo missions that required someone who could pass as a local civilian while gathering intelligence that would save American lives. The work had been fulfilling in ways that civilian life couldn't match. Every mission had a clear objective, measurable success criteria, and the knowledge that her actions were protecting people who would never know she existed. She'd been good at it, good enough that her official records remained deliberately vague, while her actual accomplishments were buried in files that required presidential authorization to access. But 12 years of that life had taken their toll. She'd seen too much, done too much, and lost too many people who mattered to her. When Colonel Morrison had offered her the chance to retire with full benefits and a cover story that would allow her to disappear into civilian life, she'd jumped at the opportunity. The retirement had been harder than any mission she'd ever completed. Civilian life operated according to rules she didn't understand. People worried about things that seemed trivial compared to the life-and-death decisions she'd been making for over a decade. They complained about minor inconveniences with the same emotional intensity she'd seen reserved for actual emergencies. They formed relationships based on shared interests and geographical proximity rather than life-and-death trust. For 8 months, she'd been trying to learn how to live in this new world. The job at the security firm was supposed to be a bridge, utilizing some of her skills while allowing her to practice being normal. But normal people didn't automatically scan rooms for threats when they entered. Normal people didn't instinctively identify potential weapons and escape routes. Normal people definitely didn't end up in rooftop confrontations with local criminals. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she'd been expecting. "How's the coffee?" Colonel Morrison asked without preamble. "Terrible," Sarah replied, "but hot." "Good. Terrible coffee builds character. Speaking of which, I have an interesting proposition for you." Sarah had known this call would come eventually. Her former commanding officer had a way of keeping track of his people even after they'd officially moved on to civilian life. The fact that he'd waited 3 weeks to reach out suggested he'd been giving her time to process what had happened. "I'm listening," she said. There's a situation developing that might benefit from someone with your particular skill set. Nothing official, of course. Just some consulting work for people who appreciate discretion. What kind of situation? The kind where bad people are hurting innocent civilians and traditional law enforcement is having trouble getting traction. Sound familiar? Sarah looked out the diner window at the small-town Main Street. A few early morning commuters were walking to work, parents were walking children to school, and an elderly man was opening his hardware store. It was exactly the kind of quiet, normal life she'd been trying to build. "I'm retired, Colonel." "I know, and I respect that decision. But retirement doesn't mean you stop caring about people who need help." That was the problem with Colonel Morrison. He understood her too well. He knew that what had driven her to excel in military service wasn't patriotism or adventure-seeking, but a deep-seated need to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. It was the same instinct that had gotten her into trouble on that rooftop. "Tell me about it," she said. "There's a town called Cedar Falls, about 200 miles from where you're sitting. Population around 8,000, mostly working-class families, retirees, and small business owners. Nice place until about 6 months ago when a new element moved in." Sarah could already guess where this was heading. Small towns were often targeted by organized criminal enterprises looking for places where law enforcement was limited and community resistance was minimal. What kind of element? Human trafficking operation masquerading as a legitimate business. They've got local officials compromised, law enforcement intimidated, and the community too scared to speak up. Federal agencies are aware, but building a case that will stick is taking time. Meanwhile, people are getting hurt. Why not just send in a team? Because it's not technically a national security issue, and the legal framework for federal intervention is complicated. Plus, these particular bad guys have connections that make traditional law enforcement approaches problematic. Sarah understood the subtext. This was the kind of gray area operation that required someone who could work outside official channels while maintaining plausible deniability for everyone involved. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Go take a look. Make an assessment. If you think the situation warrants intervention, we'll discuss next steps. If not, you walk away with no obligations. Either way, there's compensation that will set you up nicely for whatever comes next in your civilian life." The offer was tempting for reasons that had nothing to do with money. Sarah had spent the last 8 months feeling like she was wasting skills and experience that could make a real difference in the world. But she'd also spent those months learning to appreciate the simple pleasures of a life where the biggest worry was whether the coffee was strong enough. "I need to think about it." "Of course, but don't think too long. Every day we wait is another day that good people are suffering while bad people profit from their misery." The call ended, leaving Sarah alone with her terrible coffee and a decision that would determine whether her retirement continued or whether she stepped back into a world she'd worked hard to leave behind. She thought about Mrs. Patterson, probably cleaning up the damage left by Marcus Webb's operation while trying to make the building safe for tenants who had been living in fear. She thought about the young women she'd seen in conflict zones, victims of trafficking operations that treated human beings as commodities. She thought about the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her actions had made a difference, even if no one would ever thank her for it. But she also thought about the exhaustion that had driven her to retirement in the first place, the weight of carrying secrets that could never be shared, the difficulty of forming relationships when half of your life had to remain hidden, the constant vigilance that made it impossible to ever truly relax. Her phone buzzed with another text message. "Whatever you're thinking, remember that some people don't get the luxury of choice. J." Colonel Morrison had always been able to read her too well. Sarah paid for her coffee and walked back to her car, a nondescript sedan she'd bought with cash in Nevada. Her entire life fit into 2 suitcases and a gym bag, a habit from years of being ready to move at a moment's notice. She'd thought civilian life would allow her to finally accumulate possessions, to put down roots somewhere and build something permanent. Instead, she found herself living like she was still operational, maintaining the ability to disappear at any time. The drive to Cedar Falls took her through agricultural areas dotted with small farms and ranch communities. It was beautiful country, the kind of place where people still knew their neighbors and children could walk to school without supervision. It was also the kind of place where strangers were noticed and law enforcement response times were measured in tens of minutes rather than seconds. Perfect hunting grounds for predators who understood how to exploit isolation. Sarah had seen similar operations in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, where rural communities became pipelines for human trafficking networks that fed urban markets hundreds of miles away. The pattern was always the same. Establish a legitimate front business, compromise local officials through bribes or intimidation, isolate victims from potential help, and maintain operations below the threshold that would trigger serious law enforcement response. She reached Cedar Falls in the late afternoon, driving slowly through a main street that could have been lifted from a Norman Rockwell painting. There was a hardware store, a diner similar to the one she'd left that morning, a small grocery store, and a gas station that also served as the local automotive repair shop. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, which made it both safer and more vulnerable than urban environments. Sarah checked into the only motel in town, paying cash and using identification that would withstand casual inspection, but wouldn't survive serious scrutiny. The desk clerk was friendly in the way that small-town people often were with travelers, asking about her business in town and offering recommendations for dinner. "Just passing through," Sarah said. "Thought I'd spend the night and see the area." "Well, you picked a nice time to visit. Weather's been beautiful, and harvest season always makes everything look extra pretty. You should drive out to Miller's farm if you get a chance. They've got pumpkins and apple cider, real family operation." The genuine warmth in the woman's voice made Sarah's mission feel more complicated. This wasn't some anonymous urban environment where criminal activity could be compartmentalized from civilian life. This was a community where everyone was connected, where criminal activity would touch every family in town. After settling into her motel room, Sarah drove through the residential areas, getting a feel for the layout and the rhythms of daily life. Children were playing in yards while parents prepared dinner. Teenagers were walking home from after-school activities. Elderly couples were taking evening walks. It all looked perfectly normal, but Sarah had learned to look beyond surface appearances. She noticed security cameras in unusual locations, cars with out-of-state plates parked in residential areas, and subtle signs that suggested some kind of organized presence that didn't fit the small-town atmosphere. As darkness fell, she positioned herself near the main road leading out of town and waited. Her patience was rewarded around 9 o'clock when a black SUV with Nevada plates drove slowly through the residential area before heading toward what appeared to be an industrial area on the outskirts of town. Sarah followed at a distance, using techniques she'd perfected in urban surveillance environments, but adapting them to the different challenges of rural tracking. The SUV led her to a complex of buildings that had once been a small manufacturing facility, but appeared to have been converted to some other purpose. From her observation position, she could see multiple vehicles, more security cameras, and patterns of movement that suggested this was much more than a simple business operation. People were moving between buildings in ways that suggested tight security protocols. Light discipline was better than she would have expected for a legitimate business. Most tellingly, she spotted at least 3 young women being escorted between buildings in a manner that suggested they were not there voluntarily. Sarah had seen enough to confirm that Colonel Morrison's information was accurate. Cedar Falls was home to a human trafficking operation that was using the town's isolation and trust-based community culture to hide in plain sight. Now she had to decide whether to walk away and let federal agencies handle it through official channels, or to step back into a world where justice was delivered through methods that would never appear in court records. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "We know you're watching. Leave now, or join the others who thought they could interfere." Someone had spotted her surveillance, which meant the operation was more sophisticated than it had appeared from a distance. It also meant that other people had tried to investigate and had presumably disappeared or been intimidated into silence. Sarah looked out at the complex of buildings where young women were being held against their will, trafficked for purposes she could imagine but preferred not to dwell on. She thought about the friendly desk clerk at the motel, the parents she'd seen with their children, the elderly couples taking evening walks. All of them living in a community that had been infected by evil they probably didn't even know existed. She started her car and drove back toward town, but not to pack her bags and leave. Instead, she was planning. Because some problems couldn't be solved by walking away, and some people couldn't wait for official channels to slowly grind through proper procedures. Sarah Chen was officially retired from military service, but retirement was looking like a luxury she couldn't afford, not when people needed help that only someone with her particular skills could provide. The text message changed everything. Sarah Chen sat in her motel room, staring at the threatening words on her phone screen, while her mind shifted into operational mode. Someone had not only spotted her surveillance, but had access to her phone number, which meant the Cedar Falls trafficking operation was more sophisticated than she'd initially assessed. More concerning was the reference to others who thought they could interfere. It suggested that people had tried to investigate or intervene before and had either disappeared or been silenced. In a town of 8,000 people, missing persons wouldn't go unnoticed unless the disappearances were being covered up by people with significant local influence. Sarah powered down her phone and removed the battery, a precaution that had become second nature during her operational years. If they could send her targeted messages, they might be able to track her location through the device. She needed time to plan without being monitored. The motel room was Spartan but functional, and Sarah used the quiet to review everything she'd observed during her reconnaissance. The industrial complex on the outskirts of town was clearly the operational center, but trafficking networks required more infrastructure than just a holding facility. There would be transportation logistics, financial operations, communications networks, and local corruption systems that enabled the entire enterprise to function. Most importantly, there would be people in positions of authority who were either being paid to look the other way or actively participating in the operation. In a town this small, that probably meant at least some members of local law enforcement, possibly the mayor or town council members, and definitely whoever owned or controlled the industrial complex. Sarah had dealt with similar networks in Eastern Europe, where post-Soviet corruption had created perfect conditions for organized crime to flourish. The key to dismantling such operations wasn't just rescuing the immediate victims, but breaking the entire support structure that allowed the network to operate with impunity. Unfortunately, that kind of comprehensive operation normally required a team, significant resources, and official backing that allowed for legal consequences. Sarah was one person with limited equipment and no legal authority to act. But she did have 12 years of experience in situations where official channels were unavailable and immediate action was required to save lives. Her first priority was gathering more intelligence. The threatening message suggested she was being watched, which meant she needed to change her approach to surveillance. Instead of trying to observe the industrial complex directly, she would focus on the support infrastructure within the town itself. Sarah left the motel before dawn, paying cash and telling the desk clerk she was continuing her travels. Instead, she drove to a truck stop 20 miles away and spent 2 hours modifying her appearance and identity. When she returned to Cedar Falls, she was driving a different vehicle with different plates, wearing different clothes, and carrying identification that showed her as a freelance journalist researching rural economic development. The cover story gave her a reason to ask questions and visit various businesses while establishing relationships that might provide useful information. Small towns were often eager to share their stories with outsiders, especially if those outsiders represented potential positive publicity. Her first stop was the diner she'd noticed during her initial reconnaissance. The morning crowd consisted mostly of local farmers, retirees, and small business owners getting coffee before starting their day. Sarah ordered breakfast and settled into a corner booth where she could observe conversations while appearing to read a newspaper. The atmosphere was exactly what she'd expected from a rural community: friendly, informal, and built around relationships that went back generations. People knew each other's families, discussed local news and gossip, and demonstrated the kind of social cohesion that made small towns attractive to people seeking escape from urban anonymity. But there were also undercurrents that suggested not everything was as peaceful as it appeared. Conversations would stop when certain names were mentioned. People would glance around nervously before discussing particular topics. And there were several references to businesses or individuals that seemed to generate fear rather than respect. "You're new in town?" observed an elderly man in overalls who had been watching her from the counter. "Just visiting," Sarah replied. "I'm a journalist working on a story about rural economic development. Cedar Falls seems like an interesting case study." "Interesting's one word for it," the man said, sliding into the booth across from her. "Name's Frank Miller. My family's been farming here for 3 generations. Sarah introduced herself using her cover identity and expressed interest in learning about local economic trends. Frank was happy to talk, but as their conversation progressed, she noticed he became more guarded when discussing recent changes in the town's business environment. "Used to be everybody knew everybody's business around here," Frank said. "Last year or so, that's changed. New people moving in, new businesses that don't really fit with how things have always been done." "What kind of businesses?" Frank glanced around the diner before answering. "Logistics company out by the old textile plant. Lots of trucks coming and going at odd hours, but nobody really knows what they're moving. Management keeps to themselves. Pays well enough that people don't ask too many questions." Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with confirmation of her suspicions. A logistics company would be perfect cover for a trafficking operation, providing justification for unusual vehicle movement while maintaining legitimate business records that would satisfy casual inspection. "Sounds like it's been good for local employment," she said carefully. "Some folks think so. Others worry about what kind of business needs that much security. They've got cameras everywhere, fences, guards, more like a prison than a warehouse." Before Sarah could ask follow-up questions, Frank suddenly stood up and dropped money on the table. "Better get going," he said. "Nice talking to you, miss. Hope you find what you're looking for." His abrupt departure suggested someone or something had made him uncomfortable. Sarah glanced toward the diner's entrance and saw a man in a sheriff's deputy uniform who had just entered. The deputy was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of build and bearing that suggested military background. Their eyes met briefly, and Sarah saw recognition that went beyond normal curiosity about a stranger. This was someone who had been briefed about her presence in town. Sarah finished her breakfast and left the diner through the back exit, a precaution that proved wise when she spotted the deputy's patrol car positioned where it could observe her vehicle. Instead of returning to her car, she walked through the business district, using storefront windows to monitor whether she was being followed. The surveillance was competent but not professional grade. The deputy maintained visual contact but stayed far enough away to avoid being obvious. However, his radio traffic was frequent enough to suggest he was reporting her movements to someone else. Sarah had been in similar situations countless times during her operational career. But this felt different, because the surveillance was being conducted by people who were supposed to be protecting the community rather than predating on it. The realization that local law enforcement was compromised meant that any evidence she gathered would need to be provided to federal agencies rather than local authorities. More importantly, it meant that any direct action she took would need to account for the possibility that police response might be hostile rather than helpful. Over the next 6 hours, Sarah systematically explored Cedar Falls while building a comprehensive picture of how the trafficking operation interfaced with legitimate community structures. The logistics company employed at least 20 local residents, including several who had been unemployed for extended periods before being hired. The company paid above-market wages and provided benefits that were exceptional for rural employment, which explained why people were willing to overlook suspicious aspects of the operation. But Sarah also discovered that 3 young women had disappeared from the community over the past 8 months, all listed as runaways despite having strong family connections and no history of behavioral problems. Additionally, several families had received unexpected financial windfalls around the same time their daughters disappeared, suggesting that parents might have been paid to remain silent about their children's fate. The pattern was horrifyingly familiar from her experiences in conflict zones where poverty made families vulnerable to trafficking recruiters who posed as employment agencies or marriage brokers. As afternoon turned to evening, Sarah prepared for the most dangerous part of her reconnaissance, a close-range assessment of the logistics facility itself. This time, she would be going in on foot, using darkness and her military training to gather intelligence that couldn't be obtained through distant observation. She spent an hour preparing equipment and reviewing satellite imagery she'd accessed through secure channels that technically didn't exist anymore, but still responded to her authorization codes. The facility layout was more complex than it had appeared from her previous observation position, with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways and an underground section that didn't appear on any public records. The security measures were also more extensive than she'd initially assessed. In addition to cameras and lighting, there were motion sensors, infrared detectors, and what appeared to be at least 6 armed guards working in coordinated patrol patterns. Professional-grade security for a rural logistics operation suggested either extremely valuable cargo or extremely illegal activity. Sarah suspected both. She approached the facility from the east, using agricultural drainage ditches and farm equipment storage areas to mask her movement. Her approach took nearly 2 hours, but patience was fundamental to successful reconnaissance in hostile territory. From a position 50 meters from the main fence, Sarah could observe activity within the complex through night vision equipment she'd retained from her military service. What she saw confirmed her worst suspicions about the nature of the operation. Young women were being moved between buildings under guard supervision. Their body language and the manner of their supervision made it clear they were being held against their will. Sarah counted at least 12 visible victims, though the facility was large enough to house many more. More disturbing was the evidence of active business operations. Multiple vehicles were being loaded with cargo that appeared to consist of human beings concealed in shipping containers. The logistics of the operation suggested this was a major hub rather than a local operation, possibly serving trafficking networks across several states. Sarah was photographing license plates and documenting personnel when her position was compromised by a security patrol she hadn't detected. Professional training took over as she neutralized 2 guards silently and efficiently, but not before one of them had activated a radio alarm. Suddenly, the entire complex erupted into activity. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter. Additional guards poured out of buildings, and radio chatter filled the air as a coordinated search began. Sarah found herself in a situation she'd faced many times during her operational career, alone, outnumbered, and deep in hostile territory with civilians depending on her actions. The difference was that this time, she had no extraction plan, no backup, and no legal authorization for whatever came next. But she also had 12 years of experience in situations exactly like this, and the knowledge that if she didn't act immediately, the victims she'd observed would be moved or killed to eliminate evidence. The decision was made for her when she heard screaming from one of the buildings and saw guards moving the young women toward vehicles that were clearly intended to evacuate them from the facility. Sarah Chen had officially retired from military service 8 months ago, but retirement was a luxury that people like her could never truly afford, not when innocent lives were at stake and she was the only person positioned to help them. What happened next would never appear in any official report, but within 6 hours, the Cedar Falls trafficking operation had been completely dismantled. Federal agents arriving at dawn found detailed evidence packages that would ensure prosecutions, along with 23 rescued trafficking victims who were alive and safe. They also found the facility's leadership either in custody or eliminated, along with documentation that implicated corruption networks in 3 states and led to arrests that reached into federal law enforcement agencies. The local deputy who had been conducting surveillance was found zip-tied to his patrol car with a complete confession taped to his chest, along with bank records showing payments he'd received for providing security for the trafficking operation. Frank Miller and other local residents woke up to discover that the business they'd been afraid to question had disappeared overnight, leaving behind only federal agents, evidence trucks, and the kind of closure that small communities rarely experienced when dealing with organized crime. Sarah Chen was already 3 states away by the time the sun rose, driving toward another anonymous town where she could try once again to build a quiet civilian life. But her phone contained new contact information for a network of people who specialized in problems that couldn't be solved through official channels. She'd learned something important during her time in Cedar Falls. Retirement wasn't about stopping work, it was about choosing which work mattered most. And sometimes, the most important work was the kind that happened in shadows, performed by people who would never receive recognition or gratitude. 2 weeks later, Sarah was sitting in another small-town diner when her phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Morrison. "Nice work in Cedar Falls. When you're ready for the next one, call me. There's always more work for people who understand that some problems require unconventional solutions." Sarah deleted the message, but she didn't throw away the phone. Because she was beginning to understand that her real retirement wouldn't come from walking away from the work, but from choosing to do it on her own terms, for people who needed help that no one else could provide. The woman who had been shoved from a rooftop by small-time criminals had discovered that the world was full of people who preyed on the innocent, and that sometimes the only thing standing between victims and predators was someone willing to step out of the shadows long enough to level the playing field. It wasn't the peaceful civilian life she'd planned, but it was a life that mattered. And for someone with her skills and experience, that might be the closest thing to retirement she would ever find. The diner coffee was still terrible, but Sarah had learned to appreciate small comforts wherever she could find them. Outside the window, another small town was going about its daily business, unaware that someone was watching over them from the shadows. It was exactly where she belonged,